the focus of the European Commission has been usually to look how do we innovate with nature, and cities would be the locus where a lot of innovation would take place. So therefore they felt, well, if we're going to be doing scaling out nature-based solutions, let's start with cities because it's where it's going to have the biggest impact, but also be mindful that some of the solutions in cities could also be transposed to a rural or small towns, not necessarily rural, but I mean small towns or villages outside cities. So we're still at the stage of the urban concentration for a vast majority, but not everybody's focusing on that. A lot more people are focusing, a lot of people are focusing on areas that are outside cities and how do we innovate in those spaces. And it's still a developing arena for research and discussion.
Okay, thank you, Marcus. I think that answers the question. There's another question. It would be great to receive a certification for attending this course, this great course. Is that possible? It is something that we have done in many cases for other courses, and in this case being online, and the participants are also changing all the time. I don't think we will be doing this time, but it's something we will consider for other ReNature training courses. Okay. Unless there's other questions which we haven't answered so far, Lynn.
I just wondered what the plan is for the slot where Tiago Freitas was going to speak. Are we going to stick with the original program or fill the time with discussion?
I think we're going directly to the presentation by Davide now.
So what happens if people wanted to join, if they've seen the program and they wanted to join just for later presentations, they'll join at the wrong time?
Yes.
We
agree, Lynn, but it's also something that we have to manage in a way, because the other option would be to leave 45 minutes out of the program today without a presentation. And anyway, David and Marcus have included a few extra slides to cover also for this time.
Okay.
More or less. It's something which was unforeseen, unfortunately. Okay, so I think we can go to the presentation by Davide now, by Davide Gelletti and Davide Longato. Davide, you are free to share the screen.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mario, and good morning and good afternoon. This session focuses on cities, so we will discuss ways to design and implement nature-based solutions, and particularly by using urban plans, which are one of the most important instruments that are used around the world to shape and to steer the future of our cities. I will present some insights from a study we are conducting in Italy, and later on, my colleague Davide Longato will share some experiences from Malta, from our ongoing work in Malta, related, of course, to our ReNature project. Cities are, of course, where most of the people live. So finding clever and efficient ways of including nature-based solutions in cities is important to ensure that we'll actually achieve our targets and reach our beneficiaries. That means carving green space, like you see here, within urban areas, within buildings, or using directly buildings to through green roof or green walls to mix basically green and gray infrastructure, like you see also in this other picture here. So this is something that recent policies and programs have been advanced, have been advocating a lot. And among these, I would like to quote the very recent EU biodiversity strategy for 2030, which was released just a few months ago in May this year. And this strategy, which would be hopefully very, very influential, is all about bringing nature back in our lives, and many paragraphs are actually devoted to bringing nature back in our cities. So among the targets, among the objectives that the strategy has set, there is the explicit need to systematically integrate nature-based solutions into urban planning. And this is something that we have been working on during the last couple of years, and particularly jointly with the administration of the city of Trento, which is a medium-sized city located in northeastern Italy. We have this collaboration ongoing for a few years, try to help the city developing the new urban plan, and particularly trying to make sure that this urban plan reflects the increased attention and also the increased knowledge that we have collected about urban ecosystem services. So the idea was to experiment a way to systematically integrate nature-based solutions along with the planning activities of the city. The approach that we design is what we call a performance-based planning approach. And I'm going to say a few words in general about performance-based planning, and then we'll describe more in detail our approach and the way it has been applied in the city of Trento. So broadly speaking, we can distinguish two endpoints among the approaches used by urban plans. At the one end, there is prescriptive planning, and at the other end, performance-based planning. In reality, most plans fall somewhere in between and adopt a mixed approach. And we're going to describe now what I mean by prescriptive planning, and then I'll introduce what performance-based planning are all about. So in prescriptive planning, an example, the most common example is zoning, or a zoning scheme that is adopted to subdivide a city area into units and then assign to each unit a set of functions that are allowed, a set of possible land use transformation. And usually these functions, these land use transformations, are described in detail by specifying things like, for example, the developer rights that can be associated to each parcel, and regulations such as building size, floor space, density, green area ratio, and so on. So the idea is that you specify basically unit by unit, square meter by square meter, what can and cannot be done in the future. So that whenever a development proposal comes in, you as an administrator, perform a conformity assessment. So you check whether that proposal meets the regulations that have been established for that specific unit, that specific physical space in the city. And if it does comply with the regulation, then the development is approved. If it's not approved. So with this approach, plans are very strict. There's no flexibility allowed in principle, even though it must depend about how detailed are the actual regulations that you assign, that you specify for each location. And plan produces quite a predictable outcome. So you know exactly how the city is expected to develop in the future due to the very precise set of regulations that you have assigned to different units. At the opposite of the spectrum, there are approaches called performance-based, where the plan is much more strategic in that it identifies a set of goals, set of long-term strategies, a sort of path along which you want your city to develop, but you do not define exactly what should happen and where. You simply identify a set of criteria and requirements, a set of characteristics, a set of performance levels that you expect future development to have. And then whenever a proposal is made, you perform an impact assessment to see whether that proposal with that design, those characteristics in that specific location meet the general objective of the plan. So it's bound to contribute to the objective. It's bound to steer city toward the direction where we would like to be going in the future. So the idea is that you allow for much more flexibility. the outcome is much less predictable because it much depends upon the kind of proposals and the way they physically and they mutually arrange in the space. But of course, this increases also the level of complexity and the burden that the administration has to face when dealing with proposals, when assessing proposals. So there's a high need for time, resources, data, and expertise to basically perform this impact assessment and decide whether a given proposal can be implemented in the suggested area or not. So it's much higher in terms of management complexity. Again, in reality, most plans fall somewhere in between these two ends. Performance-based planning approaches have been particularly popular when trying to introduce environmentally related criteria, environmentally related performance. So there are quite a few examples around the world, in Europe, Australia, the US, where these kind of approaches have been used, for example, for reducing land take, so for protecting soil from urban development, or for increasing overall the amount of green space associated to new development. As an example, this is one of the most advanced approaches, performance-based approaches, that basically it has been implemented in Oslo, possibly also elsewhere. And what you see here is one example of the scoring system that this approach, which is called green-blue factor, implements to check whether a given development can be allowed or not. So the idea is that by looking at characteristics such as the green space, but also soil depth, soil type, vegetation type, and so on, your proposal will have an overall score according to the table and other tables similar to this one. And then the proposal can be accepted, can go on only if it meets a minimum threshold. So only if its characteristics combine, let's say, guarantee that it will provide a minimum level of quality to the future urban space. So this is just one example of possible performance-based approaches. And this is something that inspired us to develop our own approach, which is based on a quite detailed extensive use of ecosystem service information. So in our approach, the performance criteria, so the requirements that new developments need to meet, are based on information about ecosystem service supply and demand. And this information is used to figure out the kind of performance that new developments need to have and the kind of nature-based solutions that need to be associated to this development in order for it to be acceptable, in order to be authorized and go on. I'm going to briefly present the overall rationale of the approach, and then some more detail, and finally some examples. So here you see the main conceptual approach. The idea is that there is a preliminary and quite intensive analysis stage, you see here, where information about relevant ecosystem services in the urban context is collected, assessed, and analyzed, both in terms of supply, so the current supply of ecosystem services provided by the existing green space in the city, and in terms of demand, so the actual demand for services by citizens, which is modeled and quantified by looking at things like the number of people living in different areas, so population density, but also the age groups, for example, or the specific needs for, I don't know, runoff mitigation if an area is particularly exposed to this kind of problem. So once we know the current supply of services, we can figure out the expected impact of future development in every location, hence suggest a required level of performance that new developments need to have. So the supply of services is used to figure out how much we expect from new development to provide to sort of compensate for the impact, for the interference with current ecosystem service supply. And the demand is used to figure out the kind of performance, the type of performance. So according to a specific needs, there might be areas more in need of interventions for nature-based solutions aimed at reducing heat waves, for example. In other areas, the needs might be different, for example, related to access to green space for recreation or presence of green space to reduce runoff, so to adapt to climate change, for example. So the joint analysis of the supply and demand allow to identify the type of performance, the level of performance, and the type of performance, hence suggest possible NBS that need to be associated to the development in order to comply with our, let's say, expectations in terms of, let's call them green performance. So that's the general approach. I'm gonna provide a bit more detail about how we conducted the two specific analyses and how they were then merged to implement the approach in practice. So when it comes to supply, here you see an overview of the selected services, and those represent priority ecosystem services in the city according to the objectives set out during the preliminary stage of urban planning. You see there are issues associated with the microclimate regulation, recreation, but also noise mitigation, air purification, runoff, and so on. And then which service you see the indicator that was used and the method that has been applied to map the service in the different areas of the city. Some of those methods are kind of standard, so you can find them already implemented in some software that have been widely published. Others require some sort of adaptation to make them suitable to the characteristics of the city and also to the kind of data that were available and to the time frame and so on. So again, the idea for the ecosystem service supply, behind the ecosystem service supply, was to understand the future reduction in ecosystem service supply whenever new developments will be implemented, realized in different areas of the city. The result of this stage is a classical set of maps, each representing, as you see on the left-hand side, each representing different levels of supply of the different services, and then they were combined into this kind of overall or combined ecosystem service supply net, showing areas that obviously are more critical in terms of supplying services and areas that are currently less critical. So again, the idea is that whenever development proposals are made in areas that are more critical, we have higher expectation for the kind of nature-based solutions that those proposals will have to implement jointly with the buildings or jointly with the other built-up areas. And of course, also in this case, it's a mixed approach. So not everything is possible everywhere. So the performance-based approach is applied only in those areas that have been already zoned as possible areas for future developments, future urban development. There are many areas, actually more than 80% of the urban space, that has been zoned out for from future development. So that 80% will have to be preserved as it is. So let's have a look at the other part of the approach, which is perhaps a bit more original, a bit less common in current urban planning, and that deals with the analysis of the demand for different ecosystem services. So also in this case, we need to select and then map relevant indicators that could describe the different needs, for example, for the different levels of need for different services associated to different parts of town. So for example, for microclimate regulation, we look at areas that are particularly hot and areas where we have a concentration of population, and particularly concentration of the most vulnerable sectors of population, vulnerable to heat waves, I mean, like children and elderly. When it comes to noise mitigation, for example, we look at areas exposed to noise above this level you see here, and areas from which, I mean, they're currently not shielded from this noise, because there are no barriers, no physical barriers shielding noise. And the same for runoff mitigation. Here we look at areas that are particularly impermeable, and areas where we have assets in terms of population, of course, but also in terms of, for example, commercial space or office space and so on. So this enables to map different priorities for different types of services, and also to identify areas within which we expect that need to be addressed. So, for example, when it comes to microclimate regulation, the intervention, future intervention, for example, future green space, needs to happen very close to the areas that are more in need of this intervention, because the cooling effect happens only within a matter of tens of meters, maybe 100 meters, but not more. When it comes to recreation, we allow for those interventions to be a bit far away, because we accept, for example, 300 meters as an acceptable distance from the closest green area, and so on. So this benefiting area was used to create areas associated to different needs. And by combining all the different maps, so we first map individually the ecosystem service demand maps here, and then we combine them into this sort of cluster map that you see on the right-hand side. So the clusters, so different colors that you see in this map, represent different needs for different types of services. So, for example, the light blue areas are areas where the highest need is represented by runoff regulation. So here you need nature-based solutions able to address that need, to do something to reduce runoff. And the green areas are areas where the needs are in terms of park for recreation, and also park for recreation and the community gardens for growing food, for growing vegetables. So different clusters have different needs, and this enables us to understand the specific nature-based solutions that need to be provided by interventions occurring in the different areas. Of course, this clustering exercise involved a lot of simplification. We could have used 15 or even 50 different clusters. So the kind of compromise you see here is, again, a compromise to take into account the detailed information that we have, but also ensuring a level of complexity that is manageable by the city administration. So now that we have information about supply and demand, we can use that information to identify the level of performance that we expect from future urban development proposals in terms of how much. And this is given again by the ecosystem services supply map, and in terms of what, in terms of the type of performance, and this is given by the combined ecosystem service demand map that I showed you previously. From now on, it's a matter of to make this implementable, it's a matter of assigning to different levels, different scoring systems. So building up a scoring system that can combine different levels and produce a table that specifies what needs to be done and where. I'll spare the details about those tables, and I'm going to give you directly some examples of how the system works in practice. It is conceptually, so I'm not going through the numbers, but I'll just try to provide an overview of the main concepts. And for doing that, I'm using two different examples. The first one is related to infill residential developments. And by the way, this kind of infill new development is the most common form of urban growth in the city. The city is quite compact. That means that there are only few small available areas that can be converted into future residential space. And the two polygons that you see here in red are two areas that the plan have identified as suitable for future residential developments. So I'm going to show you how the performance-based approach work in terms of the kind of nature-based solutions that future residential development in these areas need to provide. So here is the location of the two areas, and here you see, well, or you guess somehow, the location of the two areas superimposed, overlaid to the map with showing the ecosystem service supply. By doing this operation, we learn that site A occur in an area where the current provision of services is medium, whereas site B occurs in an area where the provision is high. So that means that there will be different points, different score in terms of requirements associated to developments. We expect development B to provide something more because it's going to affect an area that is currently providing more services. This in terms of the how much. And in terms of the what, we can check the map below, where you see the two areas, the two sites overlaid to the current ecosystem service demand map, so the cluster map that I presented you earlier, where we learn that both sites are found in the same cluster basis, so the red cluster, which is a cluster where the main needs are related to community gardens and parks for recreation. So we know how much we expect our new development to provide, to perform. And now we also know the kind of performance that we expect from new development. So performance related to doing something about food supply and about recreation. So that means that the design of this space will have to include features like the one exemplified in these photos. So there will be residential space, but on the available space, we expect the proposal to include, for example, one or more small community gardens and to include suitable green space to be used for recreation. And again, there will be a scoring system with more details about surfaces and stuff, but this will give you a general idea. So this is the kind of NDS that will have to be associated with developments in those two sites. A second example, a different form of urban development. In this case, we are at the edge of the city, so there's more space. We're almost at the interface between the rural space and the urban space. So sites zoned for residential developments tend to be larger. There are not many of those sites, just a few, but they tend to be larger, like the one you see here. So by doing something similar, we figure out the kind of impact that the development will have by looking at the current provision of services in the affected area. And then we look at a specific demand for ecosystem services that characterize the affected area. And as you can see here, in this case, the demand is quite diverse. So there's an area where we need something related to noise mitigation, and other areas where we need NDS targeted at, for example, contribute to runoff mitigation. So again, we figure out how much needs to be done and what needs to be done by combining these two basic maps. And then here are some ideas of how development can occur. I'm just taking some pictures here to represent the fact that new development in that area will have to do something about flood mitigation, for example, by designing small rain gardens, and about noise mitigation, by shielding noise from the railway, by using some of the available space to build up vegetated noise barriers. And again, more details on the specific scoring system and so on. So that's the general idea of how to systematically integrate NDS into the urban planning process. What I presented is basically what we call a proof of concept. So the main approach is there. In order to be implementable, the administration will have to take a number of decisions about a few things, about a few key things. The first one is how complex they want the system to be. So, for example, how many different levels of ecosystem service supply you want to classify. The more you have, the more complex the system will become. The same for the demand. How many clusters of different demand you want to have? If you have just a few, it would be easier, but perhaps they won't be entirely representative of the actual needs on the ground. So that's the first issue. And of course, it will depend also about the kind of data that are available and the kind of expertise that the administration is willing to invest for managing the plan. Not so much for approving, but for actually keep on updating the system and managing the plan during the next years. So that's one thing. Another issues that need to be discussed and agreed upon with the administration is more of a, if you want, political or strategical nature. So first of all, how many services do you want to include? How many ecosystem services do you want to be considered? Just a few priority ones or more? And to what extent do you accept trade-off between those services? What I mean is that do you accept the fact that some services might be replaced by other services, or do you want to keep a minimum level for each service? So are you happy with out of kind sort of compensation, or do you want in-kind compensation to occur all the time? And again, this is more of a strategic nature. You may want to select some key services and not accept out of kind compensation for those services, or maybe just accept any kind of compensation as long as the final overall combined supply will be at least the same as you have now, or possibly a bit better, a bit more than the current situation. Another issue that relates mainly to the management of these kind of approaches is the level of transparency. So what kind of information do you want to provide to developers and actually to the general public? Everything, or just a few simplified maps that can help in, let's say, making the preliminary design, the preliminary proposal for new development? So in conclusion, there is quite a few more details that need to be considered and need to be agreed upon by the administration in case they want to embark on such a system. The advantage is that these kind of approaches allow to make extensive use of ecosystem service knowledge, ecosystem service information, which is something that has been increasingly demanded by policies at the European level, for example, but in some cases also at the very local level, where there's a push to try to include more ecosystem services into plans. Very often this results in some maps depicting the key services, and those maps are perhaps used just to steer development away from those areas. Here we try to do something more systematic and to make sure that NDS becomes systematic ways of planning a new development in cities. Of course, there are a few drawbacks to be accounted for. The first of all is perhaps the increasing complexity in the whole management of the plan. Just providing here some links to open access information that describe the work in a bit more detail, and also some background about other similar studies that we have conducted in the same context. With that, I would like to thank you very much for your attention, and I will give the floor to my colleague Davide Longato, who will present another ways of approaches the issues of including nature-based solutions in urban planning. Thank you very much again.
Okay, thank you, Davide, for the nice presentation. So now I have to share my screen. Can you see the presentation?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So, hi everyone, thanks for joining. I'm Davide Lungato from the University of Trento, and I will present some insight about the research we are carrying out in Malta to push for the inclusion of nature-based solution in urban planning. And specifically today, I will present the first steps of a research project that involve the identification of what are the spatial opportunities for nature-based solution in the urban areas around Valletta. That is the capital city of Malta. So in the picture below, you can see the study area, Valletta in red, and the surrounding urban areas. This is a place that has Malta is one of the European countries with the highest built-up percentage and also population density percentage. So especially in the part around Valletta and all the localities, urban localities around the capital cities, the space for implementing nature-based solution is very reduced. So, but what type of spatial opportunities for MBS we want to identify? We identified two types of spatial opportunities. The first one is the physical opportunities. What is the open space within the urban fabric, and so the land that is currently undeveloped. And the second one is the opportunity related to planning regulation. So through the local planning instruments, to identify what are the planning actions that explicitly advocate or provide direction for the implementation of nature-based solution. So regarding the spatial opportunities, the physical opportunities, this is the open space map with green infrastructure categories that Mario already presented in his presentation. So this is an updated map with the green infrastructure categories of 2020. We have in all the study area around 800 hectares of total open space. This open space is characterized by different land use land cover. For example, we have agricultural areas that can be abandoned or not. For example, arable areas or vineyards. Then we could have gardens. This garden could be private or public gardens. We have woodland, some kind of vegetation, forest vegetation, wetlands, and so on. So starting from this baseline data, to identify what is the suitable space in the urban areas, we identify those green infrastructure categories within the development boundaries of the city area. So these development boundaries are established by urban planning instruments. So within urban development boundaries, all open space in the future could be developed, could be subject of land use change, because development application can be granted only within these development boundaries. So after the identification of open areas within these boundaries, we excluded the unsuitable classes, for example, gardens, beaches, water courses, wetlands, and so on. These kind of classes are the classes that are already developed, so they can't be subject of a new development in the future. On the contrary, categories such as the abandoned agriculture or disturbed ground or woodlands can be subject in the future to land use change. So we want to focus on those areas to identify what kind of opportunities we can have to develop nature-based solution here in the space. So this is an overview of what is the current undeveloped urban land. So within the urban boundaries, in red we have the current urban residential areas. In green, all those categories that I mentioned before that are suitable to future development. We have around 180 hectares and more or less 90 hectares intersect residential areas. So as Davide said before, where ecosystem demand is higher. So, so we could see here that starting from the 800 hectares in all the study area, if we want to focus only in open spaces within the urban boundaries, they are very reduced from 800 to 180. And if you want to focus more in more detail in only in residential areas where the ecosystem demand are higher, we have only 91 hectares. After identification of physical opportunities, we analyze the planning instruments, the land use planning instruments covering the study areas that in Malta are called local plans. They are set at city level, so urban planning instruments. We analyze those plans. There are two plans covering this area, the North Harbour local plan and the Grand Harbour local plan, to identify the opportunities related to planning regulation. So to do that, we used a classification method that is derived from a previous study from Cortinovis and Geneletti that classify the planning actions of planning instruments by typology, target areas, and then in the next slide we will see by implementation tool. But here to provide some example, for example, the classification by typology means that the planning actions seeks to protect or conserve and, for example, existing green area, existing trees, so existing ecosystem, or to restore existing ecosystem that in urban areas could be, for example, some gardens, some degraded open space, or even to enhance the current open space through the, for example, upgrading of vegetation in green spaces, in urban parks. And then finally, the introduction of new ecosystem typologies. So, for example, when we have planning action dealing with the planting of new trees, or to the designation of new spaces for new urban park, new vegetation, new vegetated spaces, and etc. Then the classification by target area means that we identify among those planning actions that that involve some kind of MBS features, we identify where this action can take place. So this could be, they can take place, for example, in general, in widespread location. So for example, there is not specific site designated for this kind of nature-based solution development, but the planning regulation said, for example, all the remaining undeveloped areas has to include a program of afforestation. This is just an example that came into my mind, but without providing specific location in a specific place in the city. Instead, for example, the specific areas include, for example, the identification of all the residential area of a specific neighborhood or locality. So we know that all the residential area of that place can be improved or can be subject to a planning action involving MBS implementation. And then the last one, so the identification of specific sites. So when a planning action is designated to a specific development lot, to a specific street, so that you can identify exactly the location of this new development lot, for example, or these streets that needs to be improved with environmental feature and so on. And then the last classification is by implementation tool. So we classify those planning action dealing with NDS features by 5 type of implementation tools. Can be regulatory tools, design-based tools, incentive-based tools, land acquisition programs, and other type of tools. For example, regulatory tools can include the designation of an area to be protected, so the design of boundaries in the plan of some boundaries of protected areas, so where the development cannot take place within, or the establishment of some design or standard requirement for the development. Then we have design-based tools. So when more design details are provided, this is especially for specific sites. So when a specific site has some detail on which type of residential houses can, or how much place can we design with residential areas, and how much place can we design with green space. So the percentage of green space to be allocated in a specific site. Then we have incentive-based tool. We have, for example, density bonus for including green areas. So an increase of the volume of the development volume of your house if you include also green space areas, land acquisition programs, and other tools such as the guidelines for the design of public spaces such as streets and squares, or the promotion of good practice. But if you want to see more in detail all this kind of implementation tool, this is the link to the paper where the classification method is described. And then the results, after we analyzed all these policy documents, so including both the planning regulation, so the policy, the spatial policies, but also the maps of the plan. We identify 26 planning action involving nature-based solution features, classified by typology. So most of them are for new ecosystems, and most of them are targeted to specific sites. And the implementation tool, the more common implementation tools are, here we can see the guidelines for public space design, the designation of conservation zones or protected areas, and the establishment of standards or requirements for the development of a specific site. Then for those planning actions involving a specific site, so that you can identify a specific site in the map, we mapped all these actions, so 23 out of 26 policies for about 25 hectares, after removing the sites that are already developed. And this is a zoom where you can see how these opportunities related to planning regulation can be or overlapped to the already identified spatial opportunities. For example, number 1 is an opportunity site for development identified by the urban planning instruments. That is an open space, so it's overlapped also with the physical opportunities. While number 2, you can see a street that is designated for environmental improvement, that with the analysis of the opportunity of the physical opportunities, you cannot identify this because it's already developed, but through the analysis of planning regulation, this is identified. what are the next steps after identifying all these opportunities for nature-based solution, all these spatial opportunities? So the next steps are first of all, mapping the ecosystem service demand. For example, such as the ecosystem service demand map you saw in the presentation before about Trento by Davide. Then to overlap this ecosystem service demand map with the spatial opportunities we identified, so with the physical opportunities and the planning opportunities, the opportunities related to planning regulations. This is to identify priority sites for nature-based solution. For example, here, this is some maps of example. We selected five ecosystem services that are the ecosystem services that we need we need more in Malta. So after some debates and some meetings with the planning authority, we identified air purification, microclimate regulation, noise reduction, runoff regulation, and recreation as the priority ecosystem services we want to address. So with the ecosystem service demand analysis, we identified the priority sites where we need to improve these ecosystem services. So where the demand is higher, for example, in this map, the areas in dark red. Then we overlap the ecosystem service demand map with the spatial opportunities map to see what are the available space to accommodate nature-based solutions to supply those ecosystem services that are needed in the city. This is then another more detailed example. So then we will analyze the suitability of those available spaces to accommodate different kind of nature-based solution according to the size of the nature-based solution or according to the features. For example, urban park to supply climate regulation, ecosystem services should have more trees with respect to grass, for example. So all this kind of feature of a nature-based solution, and then also analyzing possible planning actions and implementation tools for nature-based solutions. So in conclusion, we saw that the physical opportunities and the opportunities related to planning regulation complement each other, because if we focus only on physical opportunities, we only identify what is the open space, but we miss, for example, other kind of planning action that we may have in already developed places, such as the environmental improvement of streets or of specific squares, and so on. Then we have that the number and type of implementation tools we identified in the current planning instruments for the case study areas are quite reduced. So in the number and also in type, we saw before with the graphic, for example, that incentive-based tools for MBS are not so common in Malta, but this can be extended, for example, in other places that we identified with spatial opportunities. Then another issue that needs to be considered is also that planning nature-based solution distribution has also to consider other issues that in Malta, for example, a big issue is the traffic management. So, for example, when we designate a street for environmental improvement, we also deal with the traffic management. We cannot say just we close the street and we put trees all around, because then in Malta with the traffic and parking is very important issues. And for example, also the planning instrument identified specific place where residential areas, specific priority sites for residential area development, because those sites are located near the arterial roads, so that they can accommodate new traffic generated by new developments and so on. So we have to take into account all these kind of other issues, not just to find open space available and say, okay, we put a nature-based solution there. And there, the last issue is that, especially in an area like in a highly urbanized area like the one in Malta here, there is a lack of ground space. Other solutions should be designed, for example, green roofs or green walls, or other solutions such as the paving soils. So solutions that, for example, in the case of green roof, do not require space on the ground, and in the case of the sealing soil, is something that a kind of restoration or renaturalization of the soil, of a developed soil. So this is all from me, and thank you for your attention. And if you have questions, we are here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Davide. We do have a question, I think, and I think that's for you to answer. So what's your argument to leave out beaches in your analysis? Are beaches included in your analysis?
Okay, no, beaches are not included yet, because we wanted to focus on areas that the planning instrument designate for new urban development. So areas that in a near future can be subject to a land use change, that in beaches this cannot happen.
Maybe I can say something about the study
Yes.
here as well. The map Davide was showing is from the en route project of the European Commission, and there we mapped all the green infrastructure in 2 local plans, basically, which are in the Grand Harbor area, which in my previous slide was that part all red, where there's so much urban development and high population density. And the beaches, as you're saying, I would go just beyond the beaches. The coastal area is probably the largest open space available. One of the largest open spaces. I mean, continuous open spaces available, and it provides very important ecosystem services, particularly for the cultural ecosystem services, but also others. And that is something we have included in ecosystem service maps from the study area. I will be showing some of these tomorrow, and which Davide, I think, has also has. But I think in this case, we focus on the residential areas to study the impact of further urban development and how to structure urban development in the future. So Davide Longato and Davide Gianletti, please feel free to say a few more words if I forgot something.
Yeah, yes, we want to focus on mostly on residential area, urban areas, because we know that these are areas where the ecosystem service demand is higher. But of course, in other parts, such as beaches, we were mentioning beaches, but also the outer boundaries area, development boundaries area, where there is agricultural land. In those kind of areas, we could have also other kind of intervention. For example, we know you Mario, know that in this local plan there are also areas designated for protection, so where the development cannot happen. So there are other kind of implementation tools outside the urban areas, but here we want to focus how to include nature-based solution in a highly urbanized residential area to meet the demand, the ecosystem service demand by citizens.
Okay, I think we have another question. So the next question is by Francesco Sica. Will the economic valuation of urban ecosystem services be included in your work?
I can speak for Trento, and then Mario may want to add something for Malta. We will, actually, we're about to start an economic evaluation, but at this point, we have no plan for merging the results with the urban planning related ones. It might be that once we see the results, we will find interesting or useful ways to do that, but at this point, it's just a separate, let's say, research stream that is not connected with the planning exercise.
Okay, well, for Malta, I think that it is something that we seriously need to think of. I mean, it's something that we should have done already in many countries by the EU, by the Business Strategy 2020. I think the target was for that to happen in 2020, which is we're at the end of 2020 now, more or less. So I think an economic valuation is really important, but I also think that often the baseline data is not there. So, for example, much of the data that we were discussing here with Davide for Malta, it's not, we don't really have a complete picture of all the of the ecosystem services, spatial distribution, and who benefits. So I guess it's the economic valuation is really important to make a case for environmental protection, for mainstreaming nature-based solutions. But beyond that, I think we need more data collection, and I think we need more. And this is also the topic of this course. You know, the science policy interface. We need to make the science policy interface stronger. So something about the data we are discussing here with Davide. This is data. I think we may have some attendees who are from the planning authority in Malta. This is data that was collected with the planning authority in a joint project. So this was a root project, and we were the scientific partner, and then we had the policy partner. So the data there is based on the urban plans, but also fine-tuning this and adding more data to ecosystem service assessments. So the short answer is economic valuation is really important. It's something that we are still in the initial phase on. It has been done for some services, but not for many of them nowadays. Okay, I think we have a few more questions, Davide. So be ready, please. The next one is integration of nature-based solutions, ecosystem service concepts in urban planning is on the rise among developed countries. Are there any initiatives, perhaps a case study among developing countries, considering that there is a drastic urban expansion among developing countries? Yeah, I think I can say something here, Davide, and then we can. In our case, we are focusing here on the work being done in ReNature, and ReNature consists of these 5 partners. But I am sure there are a few good examples of nature-based solutions implementations in developing countries. And here we have to mention, I think, the work being done by the IUCN for the Mediterranean region, but also beyond that for other countries, and also within the remit of this the CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity, where nature-based solutions are taking a central role. Davide,
I was about to make the same recommendation to check the IUCN platform for case studies with a focus on countries. And I have another link in mind. I can type it in the chat in a minute for a report by the UN.
Okay, thank you, Davide. Eva, so is there an easy to join program or platform like Launch 2020.eu or on financing like nature-based solutions projects? Here, particularly interesting are the contract harmonization and common protocol ideas that make it easier to discuss across projects and financial institutions and on capital markets. I don't know, is there an easy to join program? Any of our colleagues, Marcus?
Can I take that? Short answer is no. There is a natural capital finance facility, and there are the European Investment Bank loans for cities or countries who are developing large green infrastructure or large restoration projects. But when it comes to the local-based and smaller, sort of more country-based organizations, some countries have incentives, but there's no platform as such. However, the Horizon 2020 projects, there's quite a few of them running at the moment, and one of which I'm the coordinator of, called Connecting Nature. And in Connecting Nature, we've developed a nature-based enterprise platform, but it's not launched yet. You can wait for it for a couple of weeks. where small and medium enterprises that are nature-based, that in other words, their product is derived from nature, but directly contributes to nature conservation. These small enterprises then can network among each other and can source financing. Plus, we also, all the nature-based solution projects are building finance and business models for funding and financing in the more mainstream world rather than a niche market. This is using currently available finance through either philanthropy or through loans, through the bank system. So sorry, there's no platforms like that sustainable energy platform you mentioned there, but first of all, there's some coming and they're being developed through different projects. So if you look at the Horizon 2020, maybe Mario, what I'll do is that PowerPoint page that I have all the links to all the nature-based solution projects. Remember I showed it to you. Maybe if we can circulate that at the end of today, but I'll just put that page, I'll make sure the links are working and I'll put that page. There'll be links to different projects that have those types of guidebooks and so on. But as regards platforms, they're still in the development process like our
own. Okay, thank you, Marcus. The next question is by questions one by one. We have some questions in the chat area. Please use the Q&A section. It's much easier for us to follow. But the next question is by Jorge Spiteri. Hi Jorge. So the area which was analyzed coincides with the area where there is an intensive natural conglomeration of Vespa orientalis, the oriental hornet. I have been trying to establish honeybees in the area. Was this noted in your study? Could it be that the pest is finding shelter in dilapidated structures or unused areas? I think I can take this one. Jorge, potentially yes. So Vespa orientalis is an indigenous species, but it was considered as rare in the 1980s, but now it's becoming invasive. My take is to be honest, is probably yes. We did not study this particular aspect in our in our assessment, but I think it's strongly linked to urban development and finding shelter within the urban area, because it's tightly linked indeed to the urban cover. But this is not something that we have studied here in this assessment. The next question is by Aidan French, and so hi all. For Davide, pre-ecosystem service demand by citizens, how does this come about? What is the iteration, consultative or participatory process? And it is assumed a knowledge capacity. Does it assume a knowledge capacity among citizens? How was that achieved? And best wishes from Ireland. Hello, Marcus and Jane. Okay, have we lost Davide? Genetti?
Yes, okay. Davide Genetti, not here, okay. I can try to answer to this question. Okay, the ecosystem survey demand by citizens. We have not performed participatory process so far, but this could be an idea. But for example, for the mapping of the ecosystem survey demand, it depends also by service, like in the presentation, the case study of Trento presentation, we could have also, we may use the population data and then the spatial identification of challenges. For example, if we know that in a specific place there is a high density of population and this place is subject to flooding, the ecosystem service demand for flooding regulation, runoff regulation is higher than other places. But then we have also other kind of ecosystem services, such as recreation, that, for example, so Mario, if you can confirm this, we have some data by citizen, for example, geocache data, and also you perform some questionnaires about the recreation service in Malta. So we somehow involve also the citizen.
So if I can say something about the specific case study of Malta, which we are doing with the University of Trento. The answer. So the question was the social participation in measuring demand. I think in the case of the work Davide was presenting is based on indicators. Davide, of course, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's based on indicators which measure demand. However, this is one. I mean, this project started off as another project, and as the research started off as another project, and in that project, and in this project, we have a strong participatory. We are using strong participatory approaches. So, for example, for ecosystem service demand, we have used expert-based approaches. So not particularly focusing on citizens, but we have involved experts doing scoring exercises, for example, on cultural ecosystem services. And they're looking at demand for cultural ecosystem services like recreation, like the aesthetic value of places, like the inspirational value. In that case, yes, we do have this type of data. But I think the data we have just shown today is actually based on indicators which we are using. And for example, we depend on the population density and which demand on the density of urban development and so on. I think there's another related question. I'll take that question first before we move on to the, I think the question to Eva is, Marcus, we will be sharing the links to these projects so that we can answer that already. So thanks for the presentations. Do you plan to consider social aspects like risk perception and coping capacity of citizens in order to increase uptake of nature-based solutions in local scale? Yes, I think we can say a few words about the work we did with Lynn, maybe here. I mean, not specifically citizens, but focusing on experts and stakeholders and representative of the citizens as well, like the local authorities, for example, where we looked in that particular case at the knowledge needs, so what is required for implementation. Now we are also doing some work with the knowledge synthesis for the implementation and the uptake of nature-based solutions in urban planning. Lynn, yes?
Yeah, thanks, Mario. So I would say that these last two questions are both really important questions about the social aspects of ecosystem service demand and nature-based solutions. I think that we've done some participatory work with a particular group of stakeholders in the ReNature project, but there's a huge amount of research still to be done on the social side of all of this, particularly ecosystem services. I don't know the literature myself that well, but I think it would be really valuable to start involving citizens in consultations at this level, looking at how people feel about ecosystem services and trying to measure the demand from that way, which is a very different perspective than the indicators, which tend to be based on population and demographic characteristics and so on. So I thank you for the questions. I think that this is a major priority for research, actually.
Thank you, Lynn. Okay, so I hope that answers the question, but please feel free to send us additional questions.
So can I add to that as well? If the people who ask those questions about the participation of citizens know of research from a social science perspective on this, then it would be really great to share examples or links of research like that. It would be very interesting to me anyway. Thank you.
Thank you, Lynn. I think we can now have we had a short break planned for okay, let's see how the program. So the break was planned between 11.
If we, Mario, if we break now for about 10 minutes with, and then we'll, if everybody gets their boots on and gets ready for going out walking virtually at 12 o'clock European time or 11 o'clock UK and Ireland. Would that be good? That gives us about an hour.
That's perfect. So that's perfect, Marcus. Thank you very much. So we can start in 10 minutes at noon in our time.
Mario, I think we have a last question also. The question answer for.
Okay. So Marian is asking, Davide, is the distance of 300 meters applied to all parks? What about regional parks?
Right. Yeah, that applies to all parks, but in the urban area. So the analysis was conducted only in the urban setting. So by park, I mean a fairly small green urban lot, basically. So 300 meters is the standard distance that is suggested as indicator in Europe. And it's 300 meters of linear distance, which correspond to approximately 500-meter walking distance, which is something like 15 minutes, which is supposed to be acceptable for, let's say, a daily usage of the park.
Okay, thank you very much, Davide. Marian answers the question. I think we can stop for a break now. Let's start at noon or 11 o'clock your time. Davide, there's still a question by Marian. Can you answer via chat at this stage? Because it is good to stop for a break now. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Welcome back. I think we can go to the presentation by Marcus. Marcus, we leave some time for questions at the end, but I think we have enough time.
Okay, thanks, Mario. I'm just going to share here. So, good afternoon, good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining. Where normally we be talking about nature, we need to be outside looking at it. So obviously we can't do that. So this is as close as we're going to be able to get with this in our virtual world. What you should be seeing now is a view looking down at Dublin. I've just chosen this to take us on the virtual field trip, but you could do this anywhere you like in your own city or your own community. And at the end of this today, we'll be sending around a KML file for you. You can just go onto Google Earth, now not Google Earth Pro, the downloadable, but just the ordinary one online, and you can import the KML file, and you'll have all of this in there as well. And I hope the photographs as well will be in there. So what I want to go through today is just looking at some examples. I'll start off in a second here. Just looking at some examples. David talked about the demand for ecosystem services. So nature-based solutions are supplying that demand, or they're trying to tackle that demand. And I'm going to look at essentially 4 groups of ecosystem services, and I'm choosing my own city because it's the one I'm most familiar with, but again, you can do this anywhere. And so the first and the most obvious nature-based solution that we talk about a lot is the living roof, or green, as it used to be called, green roofs, but we prefer them to be called living roofs, as I'll talk about in a minute. These are essentially private nature-based solutions. They're restricted. You don't see them that much unless, of course, you actually live in the building concerned, or you're on the roof itself of nature-based solution. And here's an example of a development. I'm just going to use the little spotlight if you can see this little red dot here. Hopefully this is clear to everybody. So we could see this. All of the roofs here are what will be referred to as sedum roofs. Sedum is a plant. I'll just look at the photograph here. It's a plant here. You can see the times of the year it's green, and that's why sometimes a green roof is actually a red roof. Sedum is a plant that I suppose it's fair to say that it does an okay job on a roof, but remember, this is a plant that really does tolerate this type of condition, and so it's a very good plant to use to provide green cover on a roof. But does it actually do any other work? Does it do any jobs for you? Does it provide any other solutions other than greening the roof? And this is a debate that we'll come to in a few other locations as well. But however, having said all that, it does flower, it does provide pollen, it does have certain ecosystem services that are good. And of course, in the location we're talking about here on a roof, there's precious else that can be put there. So in many cases, it's a very good choice. But as you can see here, it's on a few roofs. Ironically enough, the ground area is quite gray, but the roof are quite green, or in this case, they're greeny red. And it's at different levels of growth in different parts of this development here. Not many people, in fact, I don't think anybody can actually see this who lives in that. So the residents of these buildings would largely be unaware, unless, of course, that was part of the reason they purchased the apartment in the first place or rented it, but largely unaware of these nature-based solutions right above their heads. I'm just going to move across. I've turned off the Google Earth where it makes this sort of jumping thing where you go up into space and come back down again, because I felt nauseous looking at it yesterday. So we're going to just go straight to them. So hopefully it doesn't take too much of a jump. But I'm just going to look at this one here, which is a a different iteration of the sedum approach. It's more of a biodiverse, it's more diversity in this particular roof. I'm sorry, the Google photographs or the pictures are not very clear, but as you can see, the area that we're talking about in the city is quite dense. Very little green area at all. There's a green roof emerging over here by itself, but other than that, we have very little nature in this particular part of the city. I know there's a neighborhood right beside it, but just this building estate area here, there's very little. And here we have a more biodiverse living roof. So you can almost tell by the color, but I know this because I know I know the building. And these are different species of plants. It requires a different type of construction. The sedum roof is very easy and light, and it can be put onto practically any roof at almost any angle. Whereas in this situation, we're getting to more difficult technical solutions here, more complex. But the gain from all of this, when it does work, is you do get a more biodiverse type roof. Here's an example of a similar bio-solar roof in the London Olympic site in London. So we have our solar panels, and then we also have a living structures, our living area around the roof here. So we have a different type of service, more ecosystem services perhaps, or more developed ecosystem services. Certainly more biodiversity and more opportunities. Again, it's private. There's only one little door out into here, and only one security guard, I think, has a key to that. So it's essentially not well known by people. It's nicely tucked away, and that of course benefits the wildlife. But of course, it doesn't have the same sort of social or community effects that we would like to have. Here's some examples of other biodiverse living roofs across the world as a bio-solar roof. And then as the technology starts to become more developed in terms of soil depth and the types of soils we have, we're starting to see more and more demand for one of the things that David mentioned in terms of food supply in cities. And we know, for example, that in Paris there's a agricultural roof. I wouldn't even call it a living roof. It's more of a farm that's on top of roofs, which will be supplying food directly at market prices. And those some of the more examples there. And then we start to see the technology being used to develop other types of solutions in cities. Sorry for the poor quality of this image. I tried to squeeze too many into the one photograph. But we start to see shelters and bus shelters. This one down here is a sedum one, like I showed you in the first one. But we start to see others developing that are more biodiverse in the city. So we have an interesting potential for innovation there. So we have good opportunities in what is essentially almost like an island in the middle of the city here. And again, we start to see things like this. This is another part of the city where people are actually gardening. It's not very good quality. I'll try and get a little bit closer. I'll try not to move this too fast because I know it makes people get a bit woozy when we are over the. I'd love to know how those two cars got up there. By the way, it's not actually a car park, but we'll move over to this side. We start to see people who are using the roof for a purpose that it wasn't necessarily intended for. This particular apartment, that the people who live in there demanded or went out and started constructing areas to grow things in. In some cases, they were growing fruit and vegetables. As you see here, this is not a photograph of that roof. This is from another part of the world altogether, but this is just an example of what we're talking about, that roofs provide a significant amount of opportunity for growing food in cities. Then we start to get into roofs that are actually more used by communities. So I'm just going to zoom down here. This is a specifically designed garden, and it is accessed by the building owners or the building residents, so people can access this part of the roof. So the roofs, well, we started off with sedum roofs, which were there to do a specific type of job, and much of the job that those roofs are providing attenuation of water in some cases, but mostly to insulate the building and also just to provide some form of noise barrier. Here we start to see the same properties, but more designed, more focused and aimed at different types of solutions, which are more, probably more, you could say more in the social area rather than in the necessarily in the ecological area. Although in this case, they have, it looks like, I can't tell, but it does look like there's a bit of a diversity here, and clearly a space for people to walk. I'm not sure just how comfortable that would be to walk, but I'm sure when you're up there, it's quite nice. Those of you who have been on living roofs, it's not as open, as exposed as you might think. And sorry again about the imagery. Is purely to do with Google, not to do with me, I'm afraid. We see here an example of, on one side over here, this is a sedum roof on different stages of maturity. And down in these areas here, these are private gardens on top of roofs. So essentially you have, again, it's restricted access, only people who live there, and certainly it's much more of an economic thing for the owner. You have to ask yourself the question in some cases, and this will be the question that might come up a lot during your looking at some of the images. Are these actually solutions, or is this some form of alternative design that might be at the moment more flavor of the month? It might be something that is a particular style that we are currently doing, and in the way that different styles come and go in terms of design and construction and different aesthetics in urban areas. So whereas the roof over here, just move ourselves over, the roof over here is definitely doing a specific type of job. The roof over here is very much not doing a job. It's really increasing the property value of the owners of, or the renters of that apartment. So it's a different type of nature-based solution, and in that way, not necessarily as positive as others, or as constructive as others. And I had to laugh at this one. This is a green roof, except it literally is just green. It isn't a vegetation. I managed to get up into this. It's artificial grass, but in fairness, there are some plants up here. Again, it is to do more with the aesthetic and to do with the marketability of what would be in some countries a penthouse apartment, and less to do with the providing a solution or doing a particular job in terms of the types of ecosystem services that we were hearing about earlier on. I'm going to move away from roofs in a minute, but I just had to show you this lovely artificial living roof here. It may as well be, it's no different than this one over here. So you have your black tarred or artificial surface roof here, and this is just a green version of it. So we have to be very careful when we're talking about nature-based solutions, and also green, and when we're using the phrase green, because it can be what is sometimes called in English greenwashed. It can be adopted as a selling point for a particular property, but not necessarily. It technically is green, that is true, but it isn't necessarily doing the type of providing the type of solutions that we're trying to get at when we try to scale out nature-based solutions in cities. And sometimes that can have an increasingly negative effect on the future adaptation of nature in cities for providing solutions, and it become quite cynical in some cases. So this was roofs, and I just obviously these are essentially we know how effective a nature-based solution roof is. We know a living roof can be quite effective in providing a lot of these services that we're mentioning. We were mentioned earlier on. And we know that they have these services and this value will increase as the maturity of the natural system improves or increases over time. As nature becomes more mature, it will become more biodiverse and will provide different types of opportunities in cities. But remembering a roof is an artificial construct and it has to be maintained, and you can't just put a living roof on top of a building and walk away from it. It has to obviously be managed, unlike other types of roofs, which might have a longer management or a different type of management regime. So whilst this is where the innovation side comes in, where companies can benefit from carrying out this type of work, it is also a type of expense, making it quite difficult to essentially sell a nature-based approach. And this goes for all nature-based solutions in some ways. Oops. You can't see this because it's obviously a wall I'm going to talk about next, but this is what it's above. This is just an example of a living structure. The structure was put here, according to the owner, had nothing to do with nature. It was to do with the fact that the buildings along here are extremely boring, and you could pass by this particular premises without even knowing was there. So the owner, who wasn't permission to put any form of plant or pots or anything outside on the ground, decided that they would put a living structure on the wall. And he told me himself that after he put the structure on the wall here, business increased by 30%, simply because people saw where it was and it was quite attractive, and it is maintained. And he reckons that the wall paid for itself after a year. So interesting, or it might not necessarily be a green wall. It's probably best to call this a green facade. It's essentially a structure on the wall, but it does provide certain amounts of, I'm just going to show another example here. Again, this building is under construction in Google Earth, but in reality, here's what it looks like. And it's a much more biodiverse living structure. You can see it here. It is masking over a lot of mechanical intake, or I think this is an intake which may benefit the quality of the air going in, I suppose. I'm not quite sure, but it is a much more biodiverse structure, and this is the industry is currently at this stage in terms of looking at biodiversity on living structures. In case anyone's wondering, it's they're in a country like Ireland, this doesn't have much of a problem getting watered. For those of you who've been here for the last couple of months know that unlike Malta, it's rained every single day for the last 2 months. So this may not be the type of solution that is suited to a more Mediterranean climate. However, you must remember that air conditioning units produce a significant amount of water as a byproduct. So there's no reason why you can't combine the technology of air conditioning for the building, and also the watering of structures like this. And I know there are plans in some places, and some people might have examples as well. I'm not sure which photo. Just some photographs from Scottscape, a company that does this type of work and is very much an industry leader in this area. So we start to get, whilst it is biodiverse, it's also quite aesthetically pleasing. So we can have our cake and eat it, perhaps. We have the possibility of having biodiverse plants in cities, and also providing the type of solution. But where I would find criticism, or I would make some criticism at this stage about these type of structures, is currently we're looking at plants that can survive in cities. They're evergreens, they're tough, hardy plants, and they can survive quite well. But does that necessarily mean that they are providing types of biodiversity that we would want? And Jane is going to be talking about pollinators in this course. So many living roofs and living walls, the plants would be selected in the past that wouldn't necessarily go to flower, because when something flowers, it usually dies at that stage, and certainly with annuals. And that's not exactly what the person who's paid for the wall wants to see, a load of dead plants, which we find is the biggest criticism of these living structures. However, we must remember that we're at the early stages of this type of technology. Still, living roofs have been developed over quite a long period of time. And so we do have some industry standards, and we do have some definite opportunities for improving on them, but we know where we stand with them, and there are some good examples of very good working roofs. When it comes to walls, we are still at the beginning stage. So these are, on the plus side, they're more public, they're more available to us visually, that we can see them. But we don't know just how effective they are. We know that they should be quite effective. We can tell that the noise and the heat insulation is measurable. But we still have to prove this. We still have to make a very good case for this, because if we're going to be competing with other types of technology that isn't nature-based, we need to be able to make a good, strong argument for that in order for it to be financed. In many cases, I feel that a lot of these type of structures are aesthetic choices, as opposed to the person who owns whatever this thing is behind the bridge, this building, saying, well, if we put a living structure here, it'll keep us warmer, when we can go out and get products that are much easier to put on to keep the building warm. So these are very much still at the stage of a niche product or a niche choice, as opposed to mainstreamed, as you'll find with a lot of nature-based solutions. I come to our own school here. I'm circling with my yellow the botany building here, and these areas here, which I'll show you if a picture comes up, are flush to the ground, so that rainwater will travel and it will be absorbed straight down into the ground here, so that even though there might be a lot of rain, you still can get a lot of runoff going into these areas. And again, we've got good variety of plants here, and this is our botany building. But that's not really what I wanted to show you in this picture. It's this piece over here in the new business school, as you can see, just running along here. These are, I think Aidan or whoever's on the call might correct my language here, but these are brise soleil, which are essentially shades for this large glass structure, which have biodiverse living structures within them. So essentially, it's almost a half or a quarter of a hectare of area of living different types of species. And in this situation, they're growing at an angle. They are watered as well, but they are allowed to die. There are plants in there that are annuals. And so we see an attempt by companies to come up with different types of solutions. It's a bit of an experiment in many ways. The shade could be just put there using a very fancy material. It didn't have to have living structures on it. So this is very much an experiment on whether a living structure can be used. But we have to measure the effectiveness of it. I have just one other photograph from the other side of that building, which you would have seen earlier on when Mario was showing the photographs of us all standing below that. Here we have a living structure on the wall here. And this type of thing, and the technology that's behind it there, you can't quite see the guttering, but the plant pots is now very much industry standard, and you can put these on the outside of any building. Is it doing anything at all? The only evidence I have of this wall actually having any sort of ecosystem service is from the people who work who are at the desk inside the wall in here, where they say the noise of the traffic is not as loud as it was when they were constructing the building. I'm not sure how much proof that we can take from that. In this particular image, the building is still being built, so we can't see that. So we see a few different types of hybrid ecosystem nature-based solutions. We have the living structures on the ground, and we also have the living structures in the air. And so we have different types of nature-based approaches there. Again, all of these are in the public space. They're available for us to see. They're obviously have all the other benefits of having a garden nearby, but their effectiveness is still in many cases unmeasured and not necessarily unknown, but certainly unmeasured or unquantified. And we heard both David mentioning about evidence and getting an evidence base for this, for the ecosystem service approach. So for our next one, oh yes, I want to just briefly talk about, sorry, this is a really ugly building, which is actually our food agency in Ireland. It's not the most pleasant. Hideous amount of grey roof space, which could easily be converted, but it's not the grey roof that I want to talk about, it's what's inside the building. I'd like to just talk about. So in here, we have an indoor living structure. Just in case you're wondering, it was originally designed to look like the globe. So this would have been Russia, this would have been Africa. Europe has become a kind of an overgrown plant here, and North America and South America. So for all Australia is this, whatever this is, a host or something down there. And the door has got moss on it, literally, and I mean this literally, just stapled to the door, and it's doing well, actually. It's living okay there. So we have a living wall in a very large open plan office. The next photograph this photograph will show you what I'm talking about. And it is noticeable when you go in that it is incredibly quiet for a very large open room. So there is a lot of positives that these living structures can have. And these are on the increase. We see a lot more living structures going in. I've seen them, photographs of them anyway, on cruise liners. And we see them inside large buildings and so on. The tallest one, I think, is, I think, what's the page now? I'm getting some poll there. The tallest one is I think is 30 meters high in a building in Montreal, although, or sorry, in Canada. So, but I'm open to correction there. But they do provide and can provide a lot of interesting ecosystem services that are interior. What I'm interested in here is this chair here. It's there's a photocopier nearby, and it's really would be the loudest part of the room because it's beside the door. But people in the office were telling me that most people covet this particular chair, not the chair itself, but the location, because they find that it's actually the air is clearer at this end of the office. So there are quite a lot of things we can be doing to measure the impact and the effectiveness of nature-based solutions that are indoors. Specifically in places where we can't have pots on the ground, plants growing in pots because of space requirements. So it's here that we probably would be seeing quite a large innovation industry, and we see this already. And here's my colleague, some of you might know Nikki Francis-Kaki, when we were at a conference in Edmonton, which is essentially a nature-based solution, but is a picture. It's really a hybrid version of an indoor living structure. And this is Tyg McIntyre and myself in Schiphol Airport, where they've done something similar to that door by just sticking moss up on the roof. Do find if you stand below it that it's not as noisy, but it's really quite interesting to see how nature-based solutions have been embraced by the aesthetic and the design-oriented community, which can benefit the scaling out of nature-based solutions. But you wonder just really how effective this is. We have an example of the city tree innovation, which you see in cities all over the place, which for most people, and certainly for me, is a bit of what we say in Ireland is a pig in a poke. It sounds great, but it is not really doing the job that you would like it to do. It's a little bit of a disingenuous product, but we'll see how these things go. And then speaking of greenwashing, here we are back in Malta. I thought we would come to Malta, the airport in Malta, to this wonderfully big green wall. It's not a living wall, it is a green wall. So it's artificial. So it goes back to what I was saying about greenwashing. It does a lot of work in terms of noise, and it's quite easy on your eyes. We know that green, in a background is quite comforting on humans. It's certainly good at de-stressing people. It's got a lot of potential services, shall we say, but none of them are ecological. That's all to do with petrochemical. This is all plastic. So it's an interesting area. It would be wonderful to do experiments between a real living one, and then a fake living one, and see what people's perception are. But anyway, I'm looking at the time and we're going to move on a little bit more. So that's an interior living wall. Okay, so then what I wanted to do next is I wanted to look at, since we are in Ireland and rain is our national product, and I wanted to talk about another type of well-advanced nature-based solution, rather like constructed wetlands in less urban areas, which is sustainable urban drainage, or SUDS system. Here we are in part of Dublin. These images from Google are slightly behind the times because they are the development has become more advanced in the meantime. However, what you're seeing here, just see at the bottom of your picture, is a canal, and the residents that you see, the apartments that are here, are below the level of the canal. So obviously there was a worry that if the canal was ever to overflow, that there would be an issue there. So this construction here, you can see I'm just running along the red line here. I'm going to stop here where I've got the red line now, the red dot, is a sustainable drainage system. It's a form of sustainable drainage system. You can see it here more close up. It would be reminiscent of a dry river bank, an area that floods only occasionally, and that's what it was designed to do. And here's another example of it. Not the most biodiverse. It's containing plants that can grow there rather than should grow there. In other words, these are plants that are easy to grow in dry areas like this, and it doesn't flood very much. What is perhaps a little bit strange is that the developers of this particular construction missed the opportunity of taking the roof water also into this area. So this really is just an emergency overflow system for any sort of episodic or severe flooding, but not used on a more regular basis where it rains practically all the time, and this would then become some form of standing water. I'll give you some other examples. Here we are in Glasgow, which is the site of the Commonwealth Games that was held in Glasgow. And this is a similar type of, what we could call them a rain garden or a small sink area, where flow from the path and flow from the road is being diverted into this channel in order to sink it down and to keep it out of the drainage system going into the mains. So when it does rain and when it does flow into there, it doesn't overwhelm the drainage system in the city, and it attenuates it there for a while. It sinks it down into the ground. It's, again, not the most biodiverse, but this is largely to do with the community who live here not being told what this is about, and so people don't tend to manage it in that particular way. And here's another example of a rain garden, which is also a playground or a play area. And this is the sinking area here for rainwater. This is in Barking and Dagenham in London. And interestingly, the drain area has actually, you can see by the bicycle trails here, that it actually has become probably for jumping bikes, which actually looks kind of fun from the children in the area. But when it does rain and it rains very hard, this gathers a lot of water and it drains nicely down into the ground. Much of the technology here, when it comes to drainage, really needs to be. This is an experimental. In this case, it's a living roof, looking at different types of substrates, and the idea of maybe having living roofs or roofs that are blue roofs instead of green roofs that are actually there to hold water and water alone, and have almost like a small pond on top of a roof. This is an experiment that we had when I was running the Tourist project, which is finished now. But again, when we're talking about wetlands or water, or whether it's on a roof or underground, we need to be quite expert in our substrates and what types of soils and what types of gravel and how we construct them. It's not just a simple matter of draining out or gouging out with a hole and hoping that it works. There's a lot of technology involved here that is based on the understanding of good old-fashioned geology, but also on the different types of substrates in this experiment here, these are different types of crushed materials from the building that would have been demolished. This is bricks that was crushed up. This is other types of bricks that were crushed up, to see that when you are constructing something, if you can use the materials from the previous construction that you've demolished in order to provide this type of drainage system that we're talking about in terms of sustainable drainage. And we see a few examples. I see Marianne Harris on the call here, so she will be more familiar with this area than I would from Dublin City Council. So I'm just actually not far from the previous picture, just to say where we are. We're just downriver of this particular the sustainable drainage system. So the ideal thing would be if we could link up our nature-based approaches. So we would have a sustainable drainage where people live, but also attenuation ponds. So ponds that will be constructed for along water courses in order to slow the flow, to keep that sudden rainfall or to keep that sudden flood from overwhelming the infrastructure further downfield. And certainly if there were other people's residences in this particular valley, to protect people from flooding. So in this situation, we have an attenuation pond, or this isn't necessarily deliberately constructed as an attenuation pond, but it's a good example of the type of structure that we'll be talking about. But you can do this is further down the same river. You can have a natural structure here. This is a good example of a natural structure, but also a specifically constructed, more artificial looking structure that will be a way of making it more socially aesthetically pleasurable, but also socially useful. I'm just going to quickly switch screen. I'm not sure if I can just do a new share here to hopefully this works. I'm going to shift us over now to Google Street View. This is that same location. Hope you could be seeing it quite clearly now. I'm sorry, where we would have a certain amount of say unkept area there. It's nice and like just further behind there, but this is be more social. And again, we start to see a modern construction where all the roofs are draining off away from this particular pond, but they have a proviso in terms of flooding that they can continue, that they can open up water flow into this attenuating pond. And you can see it's actually much lower down than the bank beside it, which means it's allowable to flood, so that if it does flood, it goes higher. Well, it might not be too good for the grass, but it certainly is not going to cause any harm to residences nearby. So that's the type of attenuation pond that I'm talking about. So I'm going to bring us back now to Google. Oops, to Google Earth. And then we have other types of attenuation ponds. As you can see, this is an industrial location where, by the way, there's a sedum roof there as well. And we have a more informal one, and then on the same development, a more formal one. And these are, you'll see this a lot in large industrial sites or office sites where they will try and attenuate the water as much as possible, because obviously with the large roof space and also the David mentioned about solid structures and permeability, where there's no low permeability in terms of roof and road, it pays to have these types of structures. So I'm just looking at the time and I'm conscious of that we're going to go. So I've only got a few more to show. What I want to show here is our main street was reconstructed recently to allow a light rail to go down it. And I wanted just to show some of the things you can't see. Again, I'm going to move us over to Google Street View to have a look at what I'm talking about here. This is the same street again, and these are the tree pits. These are the trees planted in pits, I should say, in the street. You can see this is a type of permeable material, but also there's also little holes here to allow air down to the roots. So and these are in all the trees. So in other words, the trees can grow out under the road under the light rail and not raise the pavement, as you might see in some cities where there is a difficulty with trees and maybe a lack of appreciation of trees because they're probably causing problems for people in wheelchairs and prams. This is a type of nature-based solution which would be quite appropriate in the Mediterranean situation. I'm just going to go back to Google Earth. And you can see that even though this is quite a formal setting, the trees have got a rather sort of architectural feel to them. These tree pits are 2 or 3 times the size of the tree involved, and so it was a good opportunity when we were doing this. I know that when you guys are here from Malta, we took a little trip here, and it was actually pouring rain on that very day. It was perfect weather for looking at flooding in a city. We see that there's a really good likelihood, a good possibility of this type of solution being scaled out. Of course, it's going to be expensive, and of course, you have to dig up the street in order to do that, which might have implications for certain cities in relation to archaeology and other types of legacy issues below the ground. But having said that, it is a good way of introducing a nature-based solution, part technological and also part nature in the city. And then to finish off, I just wanted to talk. I'm going to skip the rain garden, the Lewis rain garden, because it's a little not very clear. But what I want to talk about here is this particular park here. So we talked about nature-based solutions that were quite advanced, like roofs and sustainable urban drainage systems. The roofs don't have very much access to people. The sustainable drainage system does, but it's a hole in the ground. It's not easy to walk in or to wheel a bicycle or in. And we talked about walls, which are an emerging type of technology, but we can see them, but they're up away from us. This type of nature-based solution is a co-created nature-based solution. We have this is a park which comes from the Tourist project. I think I saw Roisin on the list of participants there, and I have to do a huge shout out. This is Roisin Byrne's baby here, or one of as part of the team with the Tourist project. What you see here is a co-created park here, but I will draw your attention to these allotments on the other side here. But first of all, I'll go to some photographs. Again, I apologize for the quality of these. I had to take them off another screen, which wasn't very good. But we went through a co-creation process in order to work with the community in designing this. And what they're actually drawing on the ground here is not pictures. It's actually where do they want things? Where do we want to put plants? Where do we want to put, where are old people going to go? How are we going to get wheelchairs in here? Where do children play? And as you can see from the top left-hand photograph, a lot of the land, which was essentially boarded off, was used for guerrilla gardening. So people were breaking in and constructing allotments and growing their own food illegally on it. And that's what the other photograph showed as well in Google Earth. Just going to show you, go back to this again. That's what this area was as well. It was an informal allotment area, although people have been doing it for quite a while. Come back to that in a second. But this is the type of solution. This is not, of course, the same place. This is in Ludwigsburg in Germany, which was a living structure that we constructed again during the Tourist project, which was deliberately constructed to help with the heat island, but it was also co-created. It was the community came together. They didn't just say, we want plants here, we want this type of tree. They were given the task of designing it and co-designing it with the landscape architects, with the city council, and with the different members of the community. So it was a very good co-creation process, and these things can be quite successful. And as you can see, I'm just going to go to actually, maybe I'll just go to Street View here in terms of it was quite successful here. It produced a play area, it produced different areas. There's a skate park in there, and for people with different abilities and so on. It is also a rain soak. But look what happened on the other side of the road that was allotments before. All of a sudden, the city council decided that whilst they've been engaging with people on one side of the road, it's time to take back the allotment area on the other side of the road and to construct on it, which caused a lot of damage to all the hard work that had been done in creating the good community feel on this side of the road. People voluntarily removed their illegal allotments, thinking that they could continue on the other side of the road. So whilst this was a really good endeavor, and it's a good example of co-creation, it's not exactly there's a lot of, let's say, moving parts. There's a lot of variables when it comes to doing a nature-based approach in a co-created way. So I wanted to leave about 15 minutes for questions towards the end. I'm sorry, I haven't had the questions and answers up while I was doing this, because I wouldn't be able to see the screen otherwise. So I'm happy to turn it back to Mario, and we can probably do some questions.
Okay, thank you, Marcos. It's great to see that there are so many initiatives going on. So that's really good, and I also like some of the points you mentioned, for example, on the benefits of nature-based solutions, the benefits of biodiversity, the co-benefits you're relating to human well-being. So that's, I think you made some valid points, and there were also some comments about this in the chat section. So I would encourage anyone who has any question to write it down in the Q&A section. There were a few chat exchanges happening, but it would be really good if people use the question and answer. It would facilitate our life, maybe Marcus' life more than ours. Yeah, and I think Marcus, something I would like to ask is if you note anything in common. I mean, some of the case studies you mentioned, probably you know them well. I mean, you've worked in them, you've worked on projects that were creating these nature-based solutions, and in the approaches. I mean, in these approaches and these examples that you've mentioned, how common is it that people actually value the benefits arising from nature-based solutions, or is it more of a project to implement a green roof or a green wall on its own? I mean,
yeah, it's like any sort of construction. Some people will just want to get the thing built, and they're not interested in the bricks and mortar. Other people have more of an aesthetic and want it constructed. That's something that they'll see it and they'll understand and they'll appreciate it. I think what I will say, and I meant to mention this, is because of the last 6 months, during the last 6 months, especially during the height of lockdown in Europe, there was a noticeable increase in people's regarding and noticing and mentioning about the value of nature and nature near their houses, near to them. So we're seeing that there is definitely a strong appeal of a nature-based approach to communities and individuals. But of course, they're not the people who build their houses necessarily. These are usually the planners, the developers, and the architects and designers. So they have there's an element of supply and demand, quite literally. So if people are demanding more nature, well, then of course we're going to see people supplying it, and that's brilliant. That is an excellent opportunity. But we have seen that where people it has that sort of wow effect certain times. So when someone walks onto a living roof or passes by a living, well, they go, oh, that's strange. But that's because it's not the normal. After a while, it'll become normal, and it hopefully. And at that stage, then people will demand a different type of nature or a more advanced form and more biodiverse, perhaps, or more or provide more challenging opportunities. So we might see sloped locations where technology developing so that the watering system can fit a sloped location. So there's a lot of definitely a lot of consumer and social demand for nature, and different demands on that nature. So it's not just, we just want a green football pitch. We want more diversity. We want more color. We want more pollinators. We want more structure. We want hills and we want trees. We want more fruit. We want different types of nature. And we don't have our own gardens, shall we say. So these will be people who may not have maybe apartment dwellers. So that means we start to see city councils, they have to both retrofit existing green areas, and then when they're constructing new green areas, and hopefully there will be a lot more green areas and closer to communities, certainly the communities that actually need them, then we will definitely see a bigger, we're going to see a bigger appreciation, more values attached to nature in cities. So I see questions.
Thank you, Marcus.
Marianne. Yes. Oh, so Marianne is, I mentioned her earlier, her working on the Talca Valley there as part of it. You can look at the performance requirements for planting specifications. So Marianne raises a very good point there, actually, the second point, which I'd like to talk about. So we see this happening a lot in cities where they go into what is quite a biodiverse, perhaps an abandoned area, or there's a remnant of a habitat there, or as Marianne says, people destroying land in order to put a green roof on the top, and then justifying it, saying, well, we're damaging the nature down here, but we're going to replace it up there. And this is quite a worrying trend, because it's almost saying that nature-based solutions, you could argue that nature-based solutions perhaps give you an excuse to carry on business as usual with damaging existing habitats in cities, or certainly in rural areas. And you mentioned hedgerows there. That is really a good example in rural locations where habitats are being destroyed, because when we're finished, we're going to be constructing a nature-based solution. So we're doing the best thing for the environment. And so we see that perhaps the nature-based approach is being hijacked by people who might have nefarious aims, goals, and that may not suit. So we have to be very vigilant with our planners and our policymakers, because this is what this training course is about. We need to make sure that they're on page and on message when it comes to what it is we're doing here. We're not trying to take away old nature and replace new nature. That is really not what we're going to do. What we want to do is we want to augment the services of all nature, whether it's old or new, and we want to scale that out. So removing a habitat in order to provide a living roof is not an acceptable way of going about business. So it is, and in some cities, especially in, as you were mentioning earlier on, Mario, with the high density cities, this is going to become the key issue. Is I'm taking away this lovely old tree in order to provide space for 3 old new trees that will be old in the past. So it's again a difficult decision process. And then Aidan, hi Aidan. Aidan mentions, oh, that thing is moving around on my screens. don't press return for a second, Aidan. So it mentions that a best example of well-resourced interdisciplinary in-house teams. Well, I can point to certain the Stuttgart region in Germany, where we see the regional council has an oversight committee over the different types of sustainability initiatives of the different parts of the city. So at a very high level, everything has to be filtered through the planning, all infrastructure has to be filtered through whether a system that says, is it sustainable? Is it supporting nature? Is it community resilient? Is it boosting resilience? Is it fair? Is it equitable? So they check all of this, which means that it's essentially they're all out of their own silos for a moment. They've got to go into this one system, and then it gets scaled out. Oh, I see David. Hi, David. Perhaps I should catch up with you offline with that, David. I think I'm actually going to be speaking to you next week about that. So sorry, I'm actually probably a bit behind in the questions, Mario. Have you got any there that I'm missing?
Okay, let me help you, Marcus. So the ones you've answered already, I'm going to remove them now from the Q&A section. There's a question now by Eva Veiko. So has so the wellcertified.com or other good living standards being discussed in the nature-based solutions context?
Yes, in fact, there's been a few projects. One particular one that it comes from the insurance companies that have been investigating whether we can standardize things to certify. So living roof and a sustainable urban drainage system can be certified, and like a wetlands, a constructed wetlands. So some nature-based solutions are at the stage where they may not be ISO certified. Some are, some aren't. But they have industry standards and engineering standards that are certified and are heading in the direction of being on the same level and the same equality as other non-nature-based approaches for construction. So it's been discussed an awful lot, and it's in train. Then developing a sort of brand recognition, developing a certification process for ones that are not necessarily like the co-created nature-based solutions, or the ones that we don't know an awful lot about their effectiveness. That's still in the development stage, and we still have a lot to work on. The co-creation side is very different. It's very culturally specific. It's very nuanced in terms of who the stakeholders, and so it's not equitable across all the cities. You can't say this is the same in Dublin as it will be in Montreal or as it will be in Melbourne. So there's sometimes standards don't necessarily fit certain types of nature-based solutions, and sometimes they do. So yeah, it's in the process.
Okay, thank you, Marcus. The next question is by Pramila. So hi, Marcus, thanks for the inspiring talk. I learned the gorilla gardening for the first time now. just quickly checked online, but got more confused. Does this gardening also occur in rural areas or urban hinterland?
Yeah, it's essentially squatting. You're breaking onto someone's land and gardening there. I do it myself, and I've received 8 letters from lawyers our community have, and we've just torn them up because land is sitting there. People are looking to grow their own food to teach their kids about food. We've got a lot of communities living near us that are refugees from other countries, and we'd like to let people use the land to just de-stress and to relax and to enjoy gardening. That's a different type of solution, very important solution based on the coronavirus issues that we've had in terms of stress and the difficulty people have had in terms of relaxation when they don't have access to gardens. So guerrilla garden, yes, it's illegal. I'll say that, and I'll say it online. And
Marcus,
I know it's
have to say you're going on YouTube.
I'm online,
but
yeah. we have been ordered to desist, but we're still growing in there. But it's now fruit that's just growing by itself as opposed to people digging anymore.
Okay, the next question. So, hi Marcus, are there maintenance issues with nature-based solutions that require upskilling of local authority staff if applied to public spaces? And if so, does this cause resistance from budgetary or cultural perspectives?
Brilliant question. That's bang on the money, Fran. I completely agree. There is, yes, a lot of the local authorities that have adopted a nature-based approach, London Borough, Barking and Dagenham, Tower Hamlets, for example, in London, and some of the Paris departments, they have adopted a nature-based approach. The Medellin in Colombia has adopted a nature-based approach, and they're training their current employees for the maintenance. But there are some things like the Brise Soleil I talked about, where you need to be a mountaineer and we know this from Milan as well, where you need to actually be hanging off a rope in order to do the maintenance. These are best left to the specific contractors. So cities can work with contractors, and have been doing this for years, where the contractor works. I mentioned Scottscape as a good example. There's lots of local companies that do the work, but at the same time, they will provide the evidence. They prove to the community that these things are working, that they are absorbing water or high in biodiversity. So we do see a good relationship there developing, but it doesn't necessarily. This is what is interesting. I want to make the final point. It doesn't necessarily cause a budgetary craziness. Maybe cultural, yes, but not necessarily budgetary in terms of the culture inside the local authority or perhaps the community. But the budgets, most of these things are now more as competitive as they ever were, more competitive now than they ever were, with the non-technical, non-nature-based approach. So it's economy of scale. The more we see this scaling out, the more reasonable it's going to be, and the more local authorities are going to be able to put it into their current and future budget lines going forward, which is actually a very, very good opportunity at this time, especially as we try to do recover, and especially with the Green Deal. This is an ideal opportunity for us to be hammering this home, and also to be generating the innovations and the companies and the budget, diverting the budgets in focusing on green as opposed to grey where possible. I think we've run out of time.
Thank you, Marcus. That is great. Thank you, Fran, for the discussion.
Thanks, guys. Thank you very much. Hope it wasn't too dizzy jumping through the sky like that.
Thank you, Pramila, for your answer.
Thanks, Pramila.
Okay, so I'm going to share my screen again. This is the end of the first day of the training course. We'll see you tomorrow. I hope you can join. You can join us. You will join us tomorrow for a second day of the training course. We have a presentation by Dr. Stuart Cunningham from the University of East London. I'll be giving a session about the effectiveness of urban ecosystems and how this can be used to prioritize nature-based solutions with our work from Malta, something I've mentioned to some extent already today. And then there's Professor Christian Albert from the University of Bochum, and that's about planning nature-based solutions in metropolitan landscapes. And finally, Professor Timon McPherson on establishing nature-based solutions for urban resilience. Okay. Thank you very much. One final thing is the results of the poll. We have 60% of not coming from academia and 40% from academia. So that's, I think, quite interesting also in terms of the project. That's it, I think, from our end. Thank you very much. And if I missed anything, panelists, please.
We'll be back tomorrow.
See you tomorrow. Thanks.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye
Have
now.
a good day.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Good day.
Bye.